This episode of the Quality Impact Podcast is proudly sponsored by Catalyst Consulting, specialists in Lean Six Sigma, operational excellence, and business transformation solutions. Catalyst Consulting helps organizations achieve lasting success through customized training, consultancy, and support.
Particularly if it's, as we have now, considerable concern about water quality, air quality, and the like. And these are all things that food production have a major impact on.
Welcome to Quality Impact, a podcast from the Chartered Quality Institute. I'm your host, Rashad Isa, chairman of the CQI. In this episode, we're focusing on sustainability in action. Today's guest is John Taylerson, a seasoned food and drink entrepreneur. He's owned and run multiple businesses, from a top-tier BRC, British Retail Consortium A-grade, dairy company to a specialist syrup brand supplying premium and major retailers. John started life on a farm and has worked across every step of the food chain. His passion? Helping food and drink businesses get their governance and finances in order. As a non-exec in the meat industry, he's navigated the crucial link between technology and commercial. He also advises boardrooms across agri-food, including meat, dairy, and breweries. I'm looking forward for this conversation. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me.
Governance, sustainability, finances, AI and technology, and the supply chain. Clearly, there is a lot to cover and a lot of moving parts in the agricultural sector. So why don't we start by setting the scene? What are the biggest challenges in improving sustainability within the supply chain?
Well, I always think there's two sustainabilities, one with a large S and one with a small s. The sustainability, I think, is, in the first instance, economic sustainability, your ability to generate surplus, be it profit or if you're a mutual, something to reinvest back, because nothing else happens, nothing else is going to be sustainable if you're not economically sustainable. To be economically sustainable in the future, though, you have to address those other issues, that other S. And that is a mixture of being in a position to supply. So it's not just the economics, but it's the logistics. You're part of a supply chain in food and drink very often. It's not all within your control or your gift. So having the ability to call upon more than one supplier in a situation, as we learned from the pandemic, is critical to being sustainable. You've got to have those risks and those aspects of your business covered off so that you know when you turn up that you've got production cover in terms of supplies, as well as the logistics, as well as the technical elements of delivering.
So if we hone down on technologies then, which I assume will play an important role in logistics and in the entire supply chain, what are the key considerations, in your opinion, in the smart farming industry?
So far as smart farming, I think it's really this integration with the supply chain, because nobody can produce anything unless they know they've got a customer for it. And in farming, that's very much a case of having to plan well in advance. So it's not just a case of what are we planting or which livestock are we going to be providing in 12, 24, 30 months' time. But it could also be about what environment will we have to cope with in the future, and therefore plant breeding and animal breeding, the logistics of supply chains, the temperatures, the amount of water, the chemicals that we might be using, both in terms of your ability to produce, but to produce in anticipation of a changing regulatory framework as well.
And how do farmers and agribusinesses ensure that they are kept up to date, and as well ensure that they're operating with sustainable soil, water, biodiversity?
It's difficult because farmers traditionally have relied on each other to give advice, if you like. They tend to follow what other people are doing. Or they rely on a steady stream of advisors and suppliers making their way up the drive to advise them what to buy, what to use, from agronomists right the way through to customers who are going to make contracts and will specify what they want produced and the way they want it produced. But that has changed a little bit. margins are tight and therefore the amount of inputs have diminished, so the number of suppliers maybe have diminished. But also legislation is moving. And because of things like Brexit and the fact that the UK has got its own devolved powers, there is a difference perhaps between some areas and others as to what you can do and the way that you're expected to do it. And the critical thing has been actually the byproducts of farming, if you like, for food production. That could be everything from when you can actually apply chemicals or fertilizers or cultivate, right the way through to what you've got to do to mitigate the risks of the byproducts of what you produce, be it runoff from fields, be it runoff from silage clamps or whatever.
I will touch base on the sustainability and how we can use it and measure it. But before I do that, if I just take a step back and ask you, how would you define quality?
I think quality is a balance between customer or consumer satisfaction, that the fact that you've got something that's tangible, its organoleptic qualities are playing there, it's edible, it's safe to eat. But quality these days, I think, goes further. I think it's the way that you make something, who made it, where they made it, how they made it. And I think increasingly, even though consumers don't know until somebody points out what the issue might be, they would expect quality to encompass those other values.
It's not only the here and now of that production phase, it's the way you make things. I like what you've said. So it encompasses...
And all the byproduct that is generated as a result of the way you make it.
Perfect. So let's take that definition and keep it in mind. And then I would like to understand, what should agribusiness consider for sustainability and measurement with that definition in mind? Okay,
so most food and drink businesses, once something arrives at a factory, an accredited factory, you're going to have a HACCP, so you're going to have critical control points, and there's a go or no-go stage to the way that you process food. And in a way, that can be applied prior to it coming to the factory. So the way you grow something, you have to grow the right variety in the right time, in the right way. So there are elements of that you could call as a critical control point. Either it's made the quality that meets the specification of a contract. There's no point putting it on a lorry and sending it off to a factory somewhere if it hasn't made that quality. And things like milk or whatever, that's quite easy. It has to have a certain amount of water or not water in it. It's got to have no antibiotics. It's got to have a certain composition of quality, be it fat, protein, or whatever. So those are things that you can measure. Increasingly, we're seeing people look at the regime that it was made under and how that was done. For example, we might touch on it later, things like regenerative farming. Now, an interpretation of that might be that those cows have got to be out for 180 days to qualify for that term. So there are things that you can't see by testing in a laboratory that are still important for the quality of that product.
And how would this entire industry leverage technologies such as AI, cloud computing, to drive sustainability and to help in ensuring that their carbon footprint, for example, is justified?
So we rely on the old adage of what gets measured gets managed. So you've got to have something to measure in the first instance. And increasingly, we're seeing things that we don't want. So don't use more than a certain amount of nitrogen, or don't cultivate at certain times. So those are things that you can record. Increasingly, we're seeing technology on the farm that means that we can record what we do or what the result was from the yield of what we did, right down to pretty much a square meter, if you like. So because we can measure what has come off a field, or the soil type, or the nutrients that it has in it, or the embedded carbon that it has in it, we're tending to get a picture that's not just historical, but also dives into more detail, if you like. And that then influences what we would then do in those circumstances on that farm. So increasingly, you're seeing tractors running around that have got GPS systems that tell you exactly where you are so that you know what you're doing at that point is recorded.
That is fascinating. You've mentioned the GPS tractors as well, but are there any other practical solutions that you see that balance this digital transformation with net zero commitments or carbon footprint reduction?
Yes, you'll see companies like Agrifood who are now doing core drills, so down to about a metre, say 15 per field, roughly speaking. And what they're doing there is measuring the embedded carbon. And that's a function of, obviously, the soil type and the topography, as well as what sort of cropping is going on and the farming regime, if you like, and therefore its influence on the embedded carbon or the ability for that field to capture carbon.
You've mentioned that in your definition of quality, it is the way things are made and it's the entire ecosystem. So it's the way we work. And the way we work changes time in and time out. What is here today is different from what was here 50 years ago. When we talk about quality assurance in general or governance framework, how can such frameworks help organizations track or be ready for the change that's going to happen in the areas of sustainability, net zero carbon reduction?
It's, I guess, twofold, really. There's the baseline, the regulation, and the imposition of further or future regulation that people are warned about. That means you will have to get over a threshold or under a threshold for, say, nitrogen use or whatever. And that of itself gives people an indication of how they should operate. That regulation can extend. So if we take a country like the Netherlands, which had a problem with nitrates, they've actually restricted the amount of dairy and agricultural production so that they can reduce some of those output problems, if you like. Equally, some of the things they've done has been more qualitative. So they've got a scheme around better chicken, if you like. So you can't have cheap food because it doesn't meet a certain standard. There's a welfare standard there and has moved the base of the market up, if you like, in that to protect producers, the regulation has said, thou shalt do it to this standard or not at all.
You mentioned earlier regenerative agriculture. So I'd like to get more of your insights. What are your thoughts on it and what are the latest emerging trends?
I think this comes right back to what we talked about in quality, because regenerative agriculture isn't new. If we went back 30 years, there was something called conservation grade. And that was almost a sort of halfway house between outright commercial production, intensive, high input, high output farming versus organic, if you like, where you are restricted as to the level of output that you can achieve. And it has that sort of regenerative element to it. So conservation grade was like a halfway house. Regenerative farming is almost like revisiting that again. I mean, some of the key principles are basically around soil and soil health. So promoting microorganisms, embedding more carbon in the soil, and moving to a more crop rotation type system, if you like. So where you have intensive agriculture, if we look at the eastern counties in the UK, we have a blackgrass problem, because if you're continuously growing cereals, they've relied on chemicals, herbicides to actually control blackgrass. Now, another way of controlling that is to say, well, we'll change the agricultural system or we'll move to more of a crop rotation so we have a break. And that also allows for soils to regenerate. So the principle, I think, is one of how can we move to a system that's more sustainable? We measure the sustainability by the microorganisms and the carbon that's captured in the soil, as well as having to be less reliant on those mitigations that we put in place because we wanted to produce as much as we could, from that system.
My sort of natural follow-up question to that would be, if I am an organization in the sector, and I'm not only talking about farms, I'm talking about the wider ecosystem, including organizations that provide digital solutions for that ecosystems, would they need to set as a priority to embark on a journey of sustainability or to play catch up or to be a leader? So in whatever stage they're at.
I think that's difficult because the technology is moving and perhaps the technology or what we can measure and what we can therefore manage is also influencing what we seek to manage. So, for example, taking core samples to measure embedded carbon in the soil might in the future be supplemented by using an acoustic measure to see what the microorganisms are in the soil. So once you start establishing a database on that basis, it then becomes something that you can measure, compare, you have a baseline. So suddenly we want to know how we improve that. So sometimes the measures lead us off in one direction, and it may well be that we abandon those. But in a way also, as technology emerges and we can measure things, we can't go backwards and apply it, but we do try and work with people, I guess, who can anticipate what those measures might be in the future and therefore start recording what we need for the future. Now, that's difficult because the regulatory framework that we produce in also changes. So how you did something at the moment may not be how you're allowed to do it in the future. You may not be able to use so much artificial nitrogen on the soil. That might be reduced. So that's going to change the baseline. Or you may move to a different sort of farming regime, use different varieties, yields may change. So you've got more than one variable when it comes back to looking at that baseline and saying, how did we improve? You may not have improved, you may just have changed. Just to finish that point, I guess, because your question was about who or how do we work with to find out what that might be. Well, apart from NGOs who probably have an influence on what government policy might be and therefore regulation in the future, trade associations, because they are very much at the forefront of trying to gather and support the people who operate in those organizations to anticipate what those changes might be, that as opposed to, say, farming unions or whatever. These are not organizations ordinarily you associate with lobbying. They're more about what's going on in the world, how is that communicated back, here are the bits that are important. So, the advice would be participate in those trade associations that are dealing with your sector and try and get the best understanding of where they feel the direction of travel might be going.
And as we operate in a volatile and uncertain environment anyway, which has now become the norm, it's no longer only for a month or a few weeks in the year, that is the norm. I really like how you've touched base on the entire ecosystem, not just participating and sharing the knowledge, but also looking into the technologies and the systems that they're working. Basically, if I understood what you've mentioned, is the entire sector needs to be a little bit more open to anticipating potential change that would come, both in regulation and in the way of working, because things that happen today cannot be hard-coded forever, because things might change. And the call of action to all of the ecosystem is that if you are developing a tool or a software or a process that links all of this ecosystem, don't hard-code it as the only way of working, because down the line, you need to be able to start measuring something new or embedding a different approach based on how this entire industry is evolving. Does that sound fair?
That's very fair. And I think that point about innovation, you don't want regulation to inhibit innovation. If anything, you want to drive and enable innovation. But we want to innovate in a direction that's sustainable. So in the past, what we've tended to do is to look at, if you like, crudely chemical solutions, if you like, to sort disease problems. Now we're taking a much more holistic approach, I think, into saying, what would the consumer expect us to have done that both protects their food and makes it safe, makes it available and sustainable at a cost, but also doesn't damage the environment or compromise the future? And in some ways, that's one of the things that I think is changing, is that we are thinking much more about how sustainable in terms of a production regime is this going to be, because we can't do it forever. Particularly if it's, as we have now, considerable concern about water quality, air quality and the like. And these are all things that food production have a major impact on.
So as you mentioned, it's the sustainability, both big S and small s, that they really need to operate within the same area. You can no longer divorce them and tackle them independently. It has to be a systems thought approach that would benefit and be deployed across.
And I think it's got a fresh overlay, something that we did for years and years and years following the Second World War was to have food security, as it was thought of. How self-sufficient are we for food? That sort of went away with a sort of globalization. But I think it's coming back in as much as how much, as part of sustainability, how much more self-reliant can we be? And what do we need to do to be self-reliant? Because we're not producing food in the same environment that we were 40, 50 years ago. Climate change has had an impact on that. We're having to deal with climatic events, which could be either very heavy rain or prolonged drought and what have you. And the varieties that we would have produced for food 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago are maybe not suitable for the ones that the environment that we're trying to produce that in now.
And if we look at your experience across different sectors and the entire supply chain as such, how do different industries or different parts of the supply chain approach sustainability and its implementation? What have you seen?
What I've seen is that we've had a sort of dalliance with non-livestock based systems, as if everybody could be vegetarian or vegan or what have you. And of course, one solution does not fit all. My trick question to people sometimes is, what crop what's the biggest crop that we grow in the UK? And people have a go. They forget that grassland pasture is our biggest single crop. It's also one of our most resilient crops. But of course, we will then rely on livestock to convert that. And that has all sorts of implications depending on what you measure as their impact. Whereas in reality, what we're seeing now is much more collaboration across the different sectors. These sectors don't work in isolation. If you want to have a crop rotation on an economic scale, it may well be that you actually have to have livestock farming working alongside other vegetable crops and the like, so that they can be part of a bigger crop rotation, so that they're actually adding value to each other, providing resilience, and in the long run, giving us a more sustainable alternative.
It is that widening the ecosystem and sharing the knowledge rather than operating in isolation. I really like that. John, one more question, please. What lessons have you learned, or would you advise quality professionals that could benefit from implementing sustainable solutions?
I think, first of all, is to realize that this is a moving feast, that things are not just because you've got your set of standards and we know how we're operating this year, it's probably not how we're going to be operating next year or the following year. And there's two elements to that. There's the sort of qualitative, how are people expecting things to be done, and things that we took for granted people become less comfortable with. Animal welfare is a case in point, where improving standards, even though the consumer may not understand them, at least we get rid of things that the consumer would become concerned about. But I think that wider implication of what is the environment that we're going to be producing stuff in, and therefore what will have to change, and measuring those changes back to the sort of output to be sustainable is not just what can you produce and the price that you can produce it, but what is its impact on carbon? What are the measures, the new metrics that you will have to record alongside that? And that drives the technology. Data points within the system, in the supply chain. What are we measuring? Where are we measuring it? What are we benchmarking it against? And how do we record that? And who do we make that information available to? And those are things that we're being asked by people further down the supply chain, our customers or our consumers, who are articulating, no, we want to see things differently. So if a supermarket wants to put eco labels, like the Belgians have done, on their food, they need to be able to go back and say, well, are you recording this information? And can you show incremental improvement? So even if you're not being asked to record it now, the systems that you'll be investing in will have to do that in the future. And I think that's where money becomes critical to all of this, because on one level, whatever you do, you've constantly got to invest in getting your system cost competitive. How much thermal load do we need to pasteurize or sanitize a food product? Alongside how much wastage do we generate? And generally, economies of scale kick in. So people are having to make capital expenditure decisions on both hard kit and software and systems and processes that allow them to not just do what is required now, that anticipates what they'll have to do in the future. And that's not just the regulatory element of it, but the economic element of it.
At the CQI, we have the profession map that talks about the context and leadership, and then focuses on 3 pillars, which is the governance, assurance, and improvement. And what you've just shared sheds the light that I think I'm not going to call them pillars anymore, because that is a perfect example of calling them swim lanes, where water actually feeds from one swim lane to the next in the same pool.
Yes.
And in this instance, quality professionals need to understand that baseline of regulation and how they're working with innovation, data, and systems, also with the mindset of engaging with all stakeholders in that ecosystem to be ready for any change that needs to be measured, that needs to be managed and included, and bring it back to the ecosystem. And that's why it's a single pool rather than 3 pillars that stand in isolation.
Is that read across, isn't it? So the implications of or requirements of one has a read across for other people. I often say to people, when we're looking at capital expenditure projects, it's not about minimizing the cost. It's ensuring that you are not in a year or 2 years' time regretting what you've invested in now, and that you're happy with what you've got in a year or 2 meets the needs of the future. So we've got to be a lot less short term. We've got to have a planning horizon that's much further ahead. And I think part of that is the relationship we have with the overall supply chain, as well as our colleagues in different sectors within the same business: technical, finance, logistics. These have to anticipate the world that we're going to be operating in the future. And that has implications for the amount that can be invested. And one of the things that relies on is that relationship we have with the downstream customers, because we need tenure. We need to know that we're going to be supplying those people in the future, because we've got to write a business plan that can be financed to secure that future.
And all of those disciplines, whether it's finance, whether it's HR, whether it's quality management, whether it's strategic, whether it's commercial, this is a very clear example that they sit under one big umbrella, which is the context of this industry. They are not operating in silo, and they're not operating, the discipline is not bigger than the actual industry they're in. Especially when you mentioned earlier that you said one of the good practices would help farmers cross-pollinate and work with different specialists to actually rotate the crop and work with different parts of the supply chain.
The whole point about if collaborating with different sectors, so field crops, grassland, cereals, what you're doing is you're doing 2 things, really. You're building in resilience, because you don't have that problem with disease or infestation building up because you've got a break in there, which is what we used to do years ago, as well as having a spread bet, if you like. You've mitigated risk. And I think risk is increasingly something that we're going to have to deal with in the future, not because we're not good at doing it, because we've learned from the pandemic that suppliers, as well as customers downstream, the stakeholders in this, will rely on us in our point in the supply chain to have managed risk for them, because they need customers. They need somebody to buy their seed, to buy their genetics, in the same way as downstream customers are relying on your ability to manage those risks.
I personally believe that as a society, we have moved completely in advance and far from the concept that when it comes to what's right, that my focus is only on one step, one point of one touch point. We have evolved significantly, and we now are very conscious as society that it goes beyond one step, and I'm actually involved ethically, morally with that company and its entire supply chain. And that's when you've mentioned clearly that they need to understand as a supply chain that they work together rather than independently.
We're all dependent on each other. We can't afford for one part of the supply chain not to take that broader responsibility, because there very often you'll find that you won't be part of that future if you can't be relied upon.
I would be very interested in knowing if on the top of your head, you can share a success story of a practical solution, practical initiative that actually was deployed that benefited the supply chain on different levels?
I think it's difficult to describe one single initiative. I think what happens is that these things evolve. So, for example, an area that I'm familiar with is dairy. Now, over the last 40 years, we have shrunk from, it was almost 50,000 dairy farmers down to about 7,000 dairy farmers to produce the same amount of milk. Now, yes, the cows have got slightly bigger and slightly more efficient, but what we have done is also we've concentrated some risk at that point. But the economies have been to the benefit of the consumer. So, for example, we still produce roughly, say, 12 billion litres of milk in the UK, but we reduce it from far fewer cows. So the overhead cost that sits across the industry has been reduced, which has meant that food inflation has been capped off. But to do that has meant we've got to find more sustainable ways of producing that milk. And a lot of that has been taking or making savings in the supply chain. So the fact that we produce cleaner milk, more hygienic milk, and we've got better capacity on the farm for storing it below 5 degrees C, means that we can send expensive milk tankers to go and collect this less often, half, sometimes a third of what they used to be. And that represents not just a saving in money, but in diesel and people and what have you. Now, the beauty of that is that milk quality has had to improve. And there's been lots and lots of initiatives that's reduced the disease and vet and med cost, because diseased animals don't produce quality milk. So the breeding has improved. The way that we milk and store and distribute has improved in all manner of ways. So the initiative, lots of little initiatives, have cumulatively provided us with a more marketable product. The one small benefit from this also is that it means that if you want to implement farm assurance, higher standards of animal welfare, reduce the sort of sickness and illness and what have you, it's much easier to do that because your estate is much more concentrated over fewer people. So those other qualitative improvements have been easier to implement as well. So I don't think it's very difficult to pick just one example. I think it's also the thing about that example is that it's broad and it's across the supply chain and relies industry-led initiatives, because there was no point individuals doing it. It needed to be done collectively. We needed to everybody to raise their game.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I gathered from your example. It's not a single independent initiative that's run by one part of the supply chain. It is industry-led, and it is about collaboration and bringing everybody together that would benefit from those handoffs and those efficiencies that don't just impact one part, but the entire sector. John, with your experience both as an industry leader as well as a non-executive director sitting on boards, how does the governance framework support the implementation, deployment, the buy-in of a sustainability framework across the sector?
I think the key thing is, on a board, your responsibility is to shareholders. To protect their interests, you've got to be an integral part of that supply chain that stakeholders, suppliers, or downstream customers can rely on. So the decisions are based around what are the risks here for the business? How do we ensure that we safeguard its future? And part of that is the sustainability. You've got to have a sustainable business that is there for its customers and suppliers and its staff and its shareholders, but also for their requirements in the future.
And I like how you've tied that as well with the earlier part of our conversation when you said quality is about the way of working and the way things are done. And it's not just an independent step. It is the entire ecosystem. So understanding that your decisions have to hold integrity because it has a domino effect and it plays in a part.
You quantify quality with hard measures, critical control points and the like, but there's a qualitative element to it. Customers and consumers, how would they expect you to do things.
That has been definitely an insightful and fascinating conversation. John, thank you so much for joining this episode of Quality Impact. Thanks for our expert, John Taylerson, to our producer, Luke Nixon. Please make sure you subscribe, download, and follow. Leave us a comment. We appreciate you tuning in. I've been your host, Rashad Issa. See you next month.